Being dragged off to Sunday school each week always pissed me off. I wanted to stay home and watch Captain Zero, the Tony Stark look-alike of the 50s. Instead, I was forced to sit in class and read the King James Version of the Bible. You've got to remember that as an Aspie, I'm really logical. But the King James Bible is not logical. In fact, it's barely comprehensible. Every week I was left scratching my head and asking myself, what the hell does that actually mean? One of the first passages that I specifically remember was from right there on the first page where it said, "In the beginning God created heaven and the earth was without form and void." Void where prohibited by law, I remember asking myself. And what is without form supposed to mean? The earth is a ball, and even a ball has a form. Of course, as I got older and became familiar with more translations of the Bible and saw for myself how different the many translations actually were, I had to wonder what the original biblical Hebrew actually said. So I made a mental note to find out for myself. Years later, when I was in college, I had the time and the resources to answer the question that had been bugging me since I was a kid. And boy, was I surprised. It seems that all of the translations of the Bible refer back to previous translations. In fact, I couldn't find even one that referred directly to the original Hebrew alone. They call that translating in light of modern theology. And that's when it hit me. None of the translators actually understood what they were translating. None of them. That was understandable because translating something from one language into another is more than just substituting words. In fact, if a translator does that, the result is often incomprehensible. The best, most accurate translation can happen when the translator takes the idea expressed in the original language and expresses that idea in the second language. So the best, most accurate translation of the Bible creation story should express that story the way the original listeners would have understood it. I say listeners because the story was composed long before it was written down. To give you an idea of how I accomplished my goal, let's look at the first 3 words of the Genesis creation story as they exist in the original Hebrew. Vareshet bara Elohim. Barashet is composed of 2 words, ba from the Hebrew word for house, and reshet, which has no equivalent in English. Ba acts as a preposition. The idea is that the family is in the house or at home. So it can be translated as in or at, or sometimes left out of a translation where a preposition would not be used in English. Reshet, however, renders in English as the prime position of a lexical domain to be determined by context. Like I said, English has no equivalent word. It usually gets translated as first, or chief, or highest, or second, or something like that. The idea behind it is that Hebrew is what's called a context-sensitive language. That is, the context in which a word is used is important to understanding what the word means. The context in this story is time, so lots of translators use the word beginning. However, a reasonable translation into English could be once upon a time. I know, but if you've ever seen the movies Once Upon a Time in the West or Once Upon a Time in Mexico, you can see that the phrase once upon a time doesn't strictly refer to fairy tales. It's also used to refer to a story that took place at an unspecified time in the past and could be true. So, back to the translation. Rashet could be translated as beginning or first, which means Barashet could be translated as any one of the following: in beginning, at first, at the start, once upon a time, or any one of a surprising number of similar possibilities. Okay, on to the second word. As if things weren't complex enough, word order is different in Hebrew than in English. So to make this comprehensible to English speakers, we'll translate the third word next, not the second word. Elohim. The key idea here is power. Someone or someones who have lots of power. The thing is, while this may be translated as God, it is a plural, which means that it can also be translated as deities or gods and goddesses. However, if you look at all the places where the word is used in the Bible, you'll discover that it also gets translated as angels or judges. So it means any being in a position of power. and that includes humans. Now in English, we do have a phrase that actually translates all of this quite well. It preserves the idea of power and can refer equally as well to one being or many beings, the powers that be. The third word, bara. This is the word translated in the King James Bible as created. The thing of it is, the root word of bara refers to grain. Now how does grain come to be translated as to create? Again, if you look how the word is translated throughout the rest of the Bible, it gets translated as choose, create, recreate, or transform. And that's a far cry from grain. Here's the underlying idea. A person chooses or selects a calf and feeds that calf grain instead of just letting it graze, and thereby creates a fatted calf. That person transforms an ordinary calf into a fatted calf. I know that many translators were aware of this because some denominations or sects of Christianity believe that the creation story from Genesis actually refers to a second creation that transforms an already existing earth. And this leads to one last question before I give my first round translation of our three words. Which beginning does this story actually refer to? The beginning of everything or the beginning of a recreated world? We're not going to go off into a long tangent for this, but basically I'm one of the people who have come to believe that the Genesis creation story refers to the agricultural revolution. I first heard this theory many decades ago. It came from a biblical scholar, so apparently it wasn't taken seriously, because a scholar from a more scientific field proposed the same theory again in recent years, and it was met with adulation. I guess now that a real scholar came up with the idea, it became acceptable. So my translation of the first three words of the Genesis creation story are, at the beginning of our story, the powers that be created in their present form. Okay, on to my translation of the first chapter of Genesis and the first 4 verses of the second chapter, otherwise known as the creation story. It's as close as I can get to how the people who heard the story when it was first composed would have understood it. This story tells us that back then no one had any idea what was hidden behind the dome of the sky, or what lay below the surface of the earth. In this story, the powers that be, whatever they were, created the world that we can see by separating whatever is now above the dome of the sky from whatever is now below the surface of the earth, and inserted our world in between. It's actually quite a clever idea when you think about it, because it demonstrates that the people who composed the story had no idea what lay beyond the scope of human senses, and were not going to make wild guesses. Also, it says that daylight and the sun are separate creations. That made sense back then, because in the morning it got light before the sun came up, and at night it stayed light after the sun set. Obviously, one did not cause the other. Now to the translation. At the beginning of our story, the powers that be created in their present form everything one can see by looking up and everything that one can see by looking down, and nowhere were there any traces of human activity. Here's how the powers that be did it. At first, all was dark. Then the powers that be separated what became the unknown above the world we can see by looking up from what became the unknown below the world we can see by looking down. They spoke the words, "Let there exist an expanse between the unknowns," and an expanse came into existence between the unknowns. The powers that be called the expanse sky, and so the first period of creation was over. Then the powers that be said, "Let light exist," and light existed, and the powers that be saw that the light was acceptable, and divided the light from the darkness. And the powers that be called the light day, and the darkness night. And so the second period of creation was over. Then the powers that be said, "Let there be sources of illumination in the skies to separate day and night. Let them mark events and the passing of days and years." And sources of illumination came into existence in the skies. The powers that be made 2 major sources of illumination, the greater to rule over the day, and the lesser to rule over the night, along with the stars. And the powers that be saw that it was acceptable, and so the third period of creation was over. Then the powers that be collected the waters into one place and saw dried out ground. And the powers that be called the dry area land, and the collected water seas. And the powers that be said, let the land produce plants of many kinds, and it was so. And the land produced plants of many kinds. And the powers that be saw that it was acceptable, and so the fourth period of creation was over. Then the powers that be said, let animals fill the seas and the skies. And the powers that be created many kinds of sea animals and many kinds of flying animals. And the powers that be blessed them to be fruitful and multiply. And the powers that be saw that it was acceptable, and so the fifth period of creation was over. Then the powers that be said, let there be many kinds of land animals. And it was so. And the powers that be said, let there be humans with intelligence and self-awareness. And the powers that be made male and female humans with intelligence and self-awareness. And the powers that be blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the land and subjugate it and be dominant over all living things. And the powers that be said, we will give to you all the crop plants for food, and to all the animals all plants for food. And the powers that be saw that it was acceptable, and so the sixth period of creation was over. And so everything was created. During the seventh period, the powers that be rested and declared the seventh period special. And that is how everything was created. Thanks for watching my rant. My goal with these videos is to present to you the world through the eyes of an Aspie. If I have succeeded, remember, the life I would love to become accustomed to is funded by viewers like you. So please like my video, share it, subscribe, leave a comment, remember me in your will, or better yet, send cash.